When people are asked about World War II, they normally think of the Nazis fighting Britain, France, and the US. But there is a lot more to World War II than that, and that is what these are going to be about. For the next however many weeks, I will be exploring the main three fronts of the Second World War. In blue here is what will be in the first documentary, in red is what will be in the second, and what is in green will be in the final one. Today, I will be covering the Eastern Front predominantly, along with the Baltic and the Balkan states. Next time will be the final one. So, without further delay, let us begin. So, the October Revolution saw the Bolshevik government usurp the position of the leading government in the former Russian Empire, and starting the 4-year-long Russian Civil War that claimed 5 million Russian lives. We all know who won. So, Lenin appointed himself head of the Soviet Union, giving Trotsky the position of deputy head, but Lenin only died 2 years into his job, and he even wrote a testimony saying that Trotsky was meant to be put as leader and Stalin removed from the Soviet Party. Now, Stalin found this letter and done everything he could as General Secretary to remove Trotsky, who was his arch nemesis. And he appointed himself as head of the Soviet Union, keeping his title as General Secretary, which he succeeded with. Now, Stalin would keep his title, and anyone who was or could have been a threat to his leadership miraculously and spontaneously disappeared overnight. Now, Stalin would then proceed with transforming the Soviet Union into the industrial powerhouse that it was meant to be. Now, I'm going to take a quick break because I could do a whole documentary alone just on the Soviet Union between its formation and World War II. So, I'm only going to be covering the very key point which is coming up next. So if you want to know about the Soviet Union between its birth and World War II, let me know. So back to the thing. So by the 1930s, all was seeming to be going well with the famines and all. But the death of one of Stalin's close friends, who was Sergei Kirov, would start an event that affected the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. This was to be known as the Great Purge. Now, the Purge was to find the killer of Kirov with Stalin's lists, essentially. Stalin had been writing names down of potential threats to his power, starting with people who were inside the party, and then moved on to the general public. And now he could use the death of Kirov to execute his plan and to use these lists with the help of the NKVD, which was the Soviet Union secret police. Now, by the end of the purge, over 1.5 million Soviets were either sent to the gulags or executed. This included high-ranking officers in the Army, Navy and Air Force, and would play to be a dominant factor in later years. As discussed in the previous documentary, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed in August of 1939, seeing the German Reich and the USSR split Poland in half, and then enact a decade-long non-aggression pact. This was something that caused a bit of controversy in the Kremlin, but if people want to live in the Soviet Union, you do not oppose Stalin's ideas. Now, on the 1st of September, Germany invaded Poland, attacking from the north from ethnic Prussia, in the west from Germany, and from the south in their puppet of Slovakia. Now, it wouldn't be until the 17th of September when the Soviets would invade Poland. But when the Polish units first saw Soviet troops arrive, they thought that they were abiding by their mutual defence pact that they had signed a couple years earlier. But when shots were fired and blood was spilled, they then realised that the Soviets were here to invade, and invade they did and win on the 6th of October. Poland had failed and had been divided, and a non-aggression pact had began. But there was worry with Stalin, because his increasing paranoia decided most of the outcomes, especially when he looked towards the northern border. Stalin saw that Leningrad, which is named St. Petersburg today, was dangerously close to the border with Finland. Now, Finland itself was a former territory of the Russian Empire, so it wasn't a problem then, but now it is. This gave Stalin the thought that the Finns might join the Germans and invade, putting Leningrad at risk. This was something that wasn't an issue, in theory, but Stalin's word is final. So they sent the Finns an ultimatum to surrender some land, in favour for no invasion. But when they got the response back from the Finns, it said no. So that gave the Soviets a reason to invade. But the Soviets didn't just have that as a reason to invade, as they staged an incident at the Finnish border to give them a solid reason to invade. This wasn't as good as what had happened in Asia with Japan, because a Finnish border force saw the whole thing take place and even radioed it in. But on the 30th of September, the Soviets proceeded to invade, starting the Winter War. This was meant to be a very, very quick war, on that it was set up to be only 2 weeks long, and thus the troops were only supplied for 2 weeks of combat. But there was just one problem. The Russian soldiers weren't supplied with winter uniforms yet, and so they had their standard summer wear, which was a brown uniform, which made them stand out like a sore thumb, making them also an easy target for the Finns. Now, the Finns did have their winter uniform, allowing them to blend into the environment and be almost invisible. Now, the 2 weeks have passed, and the Soviets knew this war it's going to be longer than expected, thanks to the Purge and to Simoheha, and not to mention the Mannerheim Line. The situation in the Winter War got to an all-time low when a report of a Russian platoon overran a Finnish position and saw that they had proper good supplies. And so the Russians halted their advance, sat down, and ate. It wouldn't be until February, early March, when the main Finnish defence would break. This defence was called the Mannerheim Line. And the Finns went for so long, and then on the 13th of March, they surrendered. Obviously, they tried to get peace talks in beforehand, but the Soviets said no and continued. But then the Finns surrendered, surrendering 11% of their land. Now, this wasn't a humiliation for the Finns. All the Western world actually praised the Finnish for their defence against the Soviet, and it majorly embarrassed the Soviet Red Army. The whole world had looked upon the largest army in the world, just got defeated by an army 1/5 of their force. But Stalin's paranoia was now less of an issue, so he could sleep tight from now. The Baltic states, these being Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, all lie on the border with the USSR, and thanks to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviets could occupy these countries, which ultimately resulted in their annexation via ultimatum. Now, the Soviets had more control over the Baltic, while the war in the West was coming to an all-time high. Italy, as mentioned before, tried to invade Greece, and failed, actually being pushed back into Albania. This meant that Germany had to help Mussolini out by allowing Hungary to join the Pact of Steel. When I say allow, I mean they sort of forced their arm into doing it, while Romania followed suit. Then there were two countries left, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. They were asked to join the Axis. Bulgaria said yes, but Yugoslavia ultimately refused, meaning that an invasion would be needed, which ultimately came, and this allowed Germany to help Italy in Greece. But now this led to most of Europe being under Nazi control, and now it was made formal with the Tripartite Pact between Japan, Italy, and Germany. But something is stirring. Something big on the Polish border. In 1941, Hitler prepared to invade the Soviet Union, breaking the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but also taking advantage of the purge. Now, the date was set for the 22nd of May, but was delayed to the 22nd of June. Now, the Allies being FDR and Churchill, even a bit of Charles de Gaulle in there, warned Stalin of a German invasion. But Stalin believed that Hitler would keep to the treaty, like Stalin had. But even deserted German soldiers said that the invasion was coming the next day when interrogated. But Stalin still believed that they would stand by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact until the morning of the 22nd of June, when calls came from General Zhukov saying that 3 million Germans had invaded. Stalin didn't believe this. He did not acknowledge one bit of it until he got word from the frontline troops, which came only a few hours later. The Great Patriotic War had begun. Upon hearing this news, Stalin was absolutely shocked by it, and he even proceeded to lock himself in his dacha without any contact, while the Red Army in Belarusia, the Baltic states, and Ukraine were being severely defeated. It would be 13 days until Stalin would emerge, and when he did, he took personal control of the army and implemented a scorched earth policy, and even enacted Order 270. Now, the Finns would also join in, taking only their lost land, nothing more, in the continuation war. Now, when the 8th of September arrived, the siege of Leningrad began, Finns to the north, Germans to the south, and this siege would last for 900 days, the longest siege in history. Now, Hitler hoped the invasion would be successful before the Russian winter came, but it wouldn't be until late September when the Germans would begin the Battle of Moscow. This allowed General Zhukov to plan and execute a counterattack, pushing back the Germans and saving Moscow. Obviously, it wasn't just Zhukov that played a part. The Russian winter had came, and the German soldiers in Russia had no winter equipment. So they had to pull back with their dead horses lining the roads, oil freezing in their vehicles, and their soldiers getting frostbite. Operation Barbarossa had been a failure, but now Hitler was drawing up plans for the following year. Hitler knew that the march on Moscow was a failure, and knew his resources were being depleted, especially his oil reserves. And then he looked at the Baku oil fields in the Caucasus. If he could get the Caucasus, then he could increase his oil supply tenfold, and even continue the war for a lot longer. And so he started his 1942 advance in the south, using the 4th, 6th and 7th Army to encircle the southern armies in the Caucasus. The plan was to take a strategic point on the River Volga and then push on the armies in the south. But Hitler would get cocky and decide to abandon that plan and execute both parts at once, sending the 4th and 7th Army to secure the oil fields, leaving the 6th Army to take the Volga, at a key city known as Stalingrad. Now, the Battle of Stalingrad would be, and still is, the bloodiest battle of the war, maybe even in history. Which wasn't really helped thanks to Stalin issuing Order 227. This was named Not One Step Back, and it allowed officers to shoot their troops should they see them retreating. Obviously, Stalin thought, Russian bullets, German bullets, what's the difference? And the Germans came so close to victory in Stalingrad when the Soviet counterattack came and trapped the entire 6th Army in what would become known as the Kessel, which in English means cauldron. Now, the initial plan was to keep the 6th Army at Stalingrad and then to resupply them with airlifts. But they needed a few hundred tons of resources to keep them alive. And thanks to the Soviet Air Force, which is now being rebuilt, they couldn't get a quarter of that in. But when 1943 was born, the Soviets offered the 6th Army surrender terms. But the 6th Army refused, and the Soviets then began to crush the Kessel, until the 2nd of February, when the remaining of the 6th Army, 100,000 men, would surrender, and the tide had turned in the east. With this, Stalin then revoked Order 227, but Order 270 remained, stating that officers could not surrender. If they did, they or their families would suffer the punishments. Now that the Soviets had crushed the 6th Army and severely hindered the 4th and 7th Army, the push into the Ukraine had begun. And the push would come to a head at the salient of Kursk. Now, the Soviets had created this salient, and the salient is basically a bulge in a line, but this was a perfect target for the Reich. If they could cut off the troop at the salient, then they could advance into the Soviet Union. But the Soviets knew that this was a threat, and so they made the salient of Kursk the fortress at Kursk. And this would be tested at the famous Battle of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk was in the Soviets' favour, thanks to the German deserters. But the battle came with a bang, and the largest tank battle in history would begin, lasting from July to August, when once again the German army was so close to victory. But when they were about to get victory, they got word. The Allies had invaded Italy, which meant troops had to be withdrawn from the Eastern Front to go sort out Italy, and the Battle of Kursk was won by the Soviets, and the push to Berlin would continue. The Ukraine would be liberated, and so would Belarusia, and the push into Poland and the Balkans began, the Soviets even took the region of Bessarabia and gave it to the Ukraine, which still remains to this day. But when they advanced into Poland, the Soviets were the first to discover the Nazi concentration camps. A harrowing sight. But there was another issue. The Soviets hated Jews as much as the Nazis did. So it wasn't pleasant to be a liberated Jew in the East than it was in the West. Now, as 1945 came around, the Reich was falling apart at the seams, and the Great Patriotic War was coming to a close. To do the Great Patriotic War justice, I would have to just completely redo Henry Kissinger's work in the documentary series Blood Upon the Snow, but I'm not going to do that because I'm not a plagiarist. Now, the Soviets would blockade Berlin and continue their advance. The Battle of Seelow Heights would be the penultimate battle in the east, taking only 3 days, but ultimately leading to the Battle of Berlin. Immediately after the Battle of Seelow Heights came the Battle of Berlin, where 2 million Soviet soldiers all around Berlin in all compass directions would march into the cities. Now, in preparation for this, because obviously Germany knows that it's failing, Hitler enacted a last stand policy, bringing up everyone that could fight to fight. Now, this would include any army who was stationed there, the SS, women, any able man, the Hitler Youth, and the police. And obviously anyone else who could be stationary defences. But the very day that Hitler had been worrying about had come as the Soviet troops entered the outskirts of the city. And their target was the Reichstag, Germany's government building, to put the flag of the Soviet Union and end the war in the West. It would only take just over a fortnight for the Reich to fall, but on the 1st of May, Hitler officially married his girlfriend Eva Braun, and then would proceed to kill himself and his family the very next day, leaving Joseph Goebbels to give the unconditional surrender to the German High Command and additionally the Allied High Command. The war in Europe was over.
Товарищи, соотечественники и соотечественницы, наступил Великий День Победы над Германией. Фашистская Германия, поставленная на колени Красной Армией и войсками наших союзников, признала себя побежденной и объявила безоговорочную капитуляцию.
Germany would be divided into occupation zones, but East Germany would be a lot different than the West. Stalin had seen 2 invasions of his countries in his life, and he wanted Germany to be destroyed, to be unable to be a threat ever again. This would begin a political battle and begin the Cold War. But that deserves its own documentary. As I said in the last documentary, these are just to summarise and give people a general picture of World War II. For those who are just starting out trying to learn it, and for those who have no idea about it. So if you like what I've done, leave your opinion in the comments below. My next documentary will be the one on the Pacific War. I will leave a link to the previous documentary in the description, along with a playlist of my whole World War II, World War I, and just war-related playlist in the comments, well, in the description below. But until next time, this is Beast, signing off.